What it do, all my little Dutchies out there between the ages of 18 and 39? We have many fun here, all times. So personally, I'm amped for this vid. We're cutting it into 4 parts: South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The 4 directions on the map, the 4 musketeers, the 4... I don't know. Let's just start this stinking thing. Enjoy the video or else I'll eat you. I will literally consume you like a rotisserie chicken. So before we begin, please keep in mind that we aren't discussing the entire history of the countries only after European contact, so, colonization and onwards. So the first Europeans to discover South Africa was the Portuguese in 1488 in an attempt to get to the Far East. A few years later, another Portugueser, the great Vasco da Gama, also passed by the southern cape. He called the land Natal, meaning Christmas, and then later reached Zanzibar. Nothing really happened until the 1600s by the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company, which is what it sounds like, decided to make landfall in South Africa and set up a small little something there in between their route to India in 1652. Around this time as well, Dutch settlers began to set up farms and small cottage communities, much to the dismay of the natives. Slaves were also began to be brought over from neighboring African territories and also India, and so began the Afrikaners, or the white Dutch people of South Africa. They enslaved the natives and also manifested their ideas of Afrikaner Calvinism, which was a religious doctrine stating that the Afrikaners were put on the southern tip of the continent and that it was their divine godly duty to expand throughout it America style, just with more racism and slavery. There's more to it than that, but yeah. Meanwhile, Brits. The Dutch were just doing their own thing for a while and their South Africa colony began to grow. However, when the French Revolution occurred in the 1780s, the British managed to snag the Netherlands South African colony since the French invaded the Netherlands. Basically, the Brits just wanted to make sure that South Africa didn't become French. Soon after the war ended, however, the Brits were turned tyrannical. Almost immediately, the UK prohibited Dutch from being spoken there despite most everyone speaking some variant of it. They were trying to get them away from Dutch culture and more aligned to British culture, but wanted them to go cold turkey instead. Understandably, the Dutch weren't too keen on a bunch of limeys rolling over them, so they skedaddled to other reaches of the Cape. Meanwhile, a bunch of British colonists began moving in. It's the early 1800s, by the way. The other Afrikaners also began to go by another name, the Boers. And boy, did the Boers really dislike the British. Around this time as well, the white boys decided to get nosy and snoop around the continent a bit. They ran into the Zulu, an orderly and militaristic tribe who, understandably, weren't too happy with some pale-skinned goobers roaming around. Granted, the Zulu weren't native to the region either, but whatever. And the two began to clash. This would begin a long series of wars between the white settlers expanding and the native tribes in the area. In the 1830s, the Boers decided to ditch the British rule and started the Great Trek, when thousands of them up and left. Now dispersed throughout South Africa, they began to form their own semi-nations. The main one we've been discussing was the British Cape Colony, but bonus, now there's more! Most of them were under the administration of the British, but were independent to do their own stuff mostly. However, some weren't. The South African Republic, for example, was completely independent but defeated by the British in 1902 and absorbed by them. The Boers also formed another country, the Orange Free State, also defeated by Britain and absorbed in 1902. That seems to be a common theme here. There was also Natalia, founded along the coast. They lasted for a little while until the British attacked them in the early 1840s and absorbed them. Most of the settlers fled to the other Boer countries, which, well, didn't last long. All this time, the British were expanding throughout South Africa and having many clashes with the Zulu people and other tribes in the area until their eventual defeat in 1878. Britain's conquest and expansion throughout the frontiers of southern Africa are remarkably similar to the US's expansion throughout North America, clashing with natives and expanding into an unknown and hostile wild land. After immense deposits of diamonds and gold were discovered in South Africa, more people began to rapidly settle there, to colonize and live, well, you know the drill. Unfortunately, that also meant more slaves had to be brought over from places like India and the rest of Africa. Around this time as well, in the north, company rule over Rhodesia was established. This was a country colony thing under Britain made up of modern-day Zambia and Zimbabwe, and they had their own thing going on. Maybe one day I'll make a video about it. Now, this one might be an unpopular decision, but I'm going to skip the Boer Wars because we need to move on. They are extremely important, but seriously, we need to move on. They didn't last that long, okay? There's more stuff to cover. Around this time is World War I, and oh boy, will it change things. Germany had a colony in Southwest Africa called German Southwest Africa. Germany lost the war, and part of that meant losing all of their colonies, including the African ones. German Southwest Africa became part of British South Africa, forming the Union of South Africa. Basically, it was South Africa, Lesotho, Eswatini, Swaziland, and Namibia unified. World War II wasn't much better. While they were part of Britain and the Allies, they had some questionable attitudes towards the Axis. For example, during the war, many pro-Nazi groups popped up and white supremacy became somewhat common among politically active Afrikaners, who adopted modified versions of the swastika as logos. Nevertheless, most regular Afrikaners did not support the Axis in any way, but it would be wrong of me to leave out the extremism, especially because it would later manifest into apartheid. After World War II, apartheid began. The extremist views on race manifested into apartheid, a system that racially segregated South Africa, black versus white. The whole thing was founded on unbridled white supremacy, and racism was spearheaded by the National Party. Specifically, this started in 1948. One thing that it did was establish Bantustans, which were reserves for black Africans on their own land. Most were filled with slums, dirty and cramped. Meanwhile, the white citizens were able to enjoy clean luxuries and normal, healthy lives. The white supremacist nature plus the constant need to put down rebellions led to South Africa becoming much more militaristic as well, spending nearly a third of their entire country's budget on just military alone. In the 1960s, even the United Nations said that South Africa's government was a crime against humanity. They would regularly kill black activists as well, basically shutting down free speech until it became overwhelming in the 1990s. The US, however, let this go on for a while because they helped the West fight against communism in Africa by intervening in neighboring Angola's communist Bush War. This all began to come to an end in 1989 when white President F.W. de Klerk became president. He was much less white supremacist and began to make democratic changes, so all around a pretty decent guy. He disbanded apartheid in the early 1990s, and finally, in 1994, apartheid fell. Namibia gained independence, and so had Lesotho and Swaziland by this time. Democracy had returned to the so-called Rainbow Nation, and Nelson Mandela came to power. Finally, black Africans could be free in their own land, and for a while, there was some awkward tensions. But ever since then, South Africa has had a black government. Unfortunately, not everything is sunshine and rainbows. While South Africa has been a modernized and not white supremacist country for decades now, it still faces some racial tensions, poverty, overpopulation, food and water crises, and more. Some white citizens are nostalgic for apartheid, but overall, they're doing pretty good for themselves. Godspeed, South Africa. I'd like to visit you one day. Well, that's the end of this video. Join us next time where I'll be covering Australia. It's also in the Southern Hemisphere. You know what isn't from the Southern Hemisphere? The blue-footed booby. Just something to think about. Checkmate, atheists.